Today, we're going to discuss a book by E M Forster called A Passage to India, published in 1924. And I'd like to begin with the two anecdotes, or to put another way, on a personal note. The first is that an American friend of mine, whom I have known for something like 30, 35 years, and who has been living in China for about 20 years, recently reminded me. We met after many years. I'd gone to China a few years ago, and I think we met perhaps after a gap of something like 20 years. He reminded me that in the earlier days, back in the late 1980s, when we first knew each other, that I had once told him that E M Forster was the writer after whom I would like to model myself. I have to say that when he mentioned it to me, I had no recollection of ever having made such a comment. But now, in revisiting the book, I perhaps have some sense of why I might have thought that Forster might be a novelist that I might like to emulate. And Forster really was primarily a novelist. He did write essays. There are several collections of essays, a very interesting collection of essays called Two Cheers for Democracy, which has several essays on India as well, a country where he spent some time, not commonly realized by many people, unless they happen to be people who are really interested in Forster and have some sense of his biography. But he lived in India for a while, where he served as a private secretary to an Indian prince. The other anecdote I want to mention is that this novel is a novel that I have been familiar with for now over 4 decades. And what I'm holding here in my hand is the first American edition of this book. Uh, and I had a habit which I've retained since then, although now I tend not to pursue this as vigorously, that whenever I used to buy a book, I would inscribe my name and the place where I purchased it. So here you can see my name over here, and it says 1st August 1980. I paid $2.50 for this first edition. And it's rather interesting that on the other side of the hardboard cover here, it says J. Boas, South Hadley 24. So this book was acquired in 1980. I was an undergraduate student at Johns Hopkins University. And I'm pretty sure I know the bookstore from which I got this book, a bookstore called Allen's Bookstore. It was a wonderful secondhand bookstore. I think it ceased to exist about 2 or 3 decades ago, before Amazon began to encroach upon, the bookstore business, and then of course it encroached upon everything else. But it's interesting here because that signature, J. Boas, is doubtless a signature of a copy that must have been owned by George Boas, who was professor of philosophy at Johns Hopkins University, and a rather important figure in what is called intellectual history, and particularly a style of thought associated with intellectual history called the history of ideas, pioneered by Arthur Lovejoy. So those are the two small personal notes on which I want to begin some of my observations on this book. I think it is also not commonly realized that the title of the book is actually taken from a poem, a rather long poem by Walt Whitman, and the poem is called Passage to India. I don't think that it is read as widely, perhaps as widely as, let's say, Leaves of Grass. And to be quite honest, I'm not even entirely certain that it may not have been part of Leaves of Grass, because for those of you familiar with Whitman's scholarship, you know that Leaves of Grass went through many, many different editions. And there were portions that were added on by Walt Whitman himself. So going back now to the novel, uh, this novel, 1924, is written in 1924. And let's recall that this is 4 years after Gandhi had initiated a movement of non-cooperation nonviolent resistance against the British. Right? So this is a movement, the first massive campaign of nonviolent um, resistance to the British, and it came to an end in the first half of 1922 after the incident of Chowri Chowra, on which there is a wonderful book by Shahid Amin. And that book is a book that I will discuss at some point in this series of talks. So the point of my intervention here simply is to remind the listener that the book is written in the midst of um, what we might describe as a concerted campaign of nonviolent resistance uh, to the British in India. Right? That is that we're talking about a time that was politically a charged time. Nationalism was unquestionably in the air. Of course, Gandhi was in 1924 in jail. He was released that same year, and I don't know what month the book came out. That's not really germane, anyhow. But even though the non-cooperation movement had actually been suspended, this was unquestionably a time when the British were having to respond to nationalist sentiments. So this book has a set of characters, uh, a limited set of characters, really, for the most part. And if we're looking at the principal characters on the Indian side, there is a doctor. His name is Dr. Aziz. Uh, he's a Muslim. I say this only because one of the things that becomes transparent when reading the novel and has been the basis of a critique of the novel is that Forster seems to have relied upon what we might call a heightened distinction between the Muslims and the Hindus. Whatever Forster's own views on the question of Hindu Muslim relations, in this novel, it seems to be the case that the Hindus and Muslims really form two separate communities, or as the British would have said, two separate nations. This is not to say that Forster is by any means endorsing a theory, a communalist theory of interpretation as such, because in fact, one of the other charges that has been levied against E M Forster, and in particular against this novel, is that it is exceedingly apolitical. That was certainly the critique leveled by Edward Said. I'm not certain that I'm in agreement with these critiques, but let us wait until we get to the point where we can begin to assess why these critiques have been offered. So on the Indian side, we have Dr. Aziz, then we have some buddies of his. We have Hamidullah, who's his uncle. We have Mahmood Ali, who is a barrister who is shown in the novel to be persistently and insistently anti-British. And we have Professor Godbole, Narayan Godbole, Hindu Brahmin, and there's an air of mystique around him. He speaks in riddles, sometimes it seems. So here we have a third critique, namely that there is a kind of Orientalism. So the Hindu inscrutability, that there's an air of mysteriousness about the Hindu. Well, Godbole would seem to embody that kind of mysteriousness. He's a bit of a puzzle. As I said, he speaks in riddles sometimes, or what appear to be riddles to most reasonable people. Right? And then there's a barrister, Amrit Rao. He has a relatively small role to play, um, when he's going to be summoned to defend Dr. Aziz. I haven't described the plot yet, of course, but these are the principal Indian characters. On the British side, we have, I would say, a rather larger cast of characters, principal characters. So we begin with Adela Quested, a young English woman who arrives in India with her prospective mother-in-law, Mrs. Moore. So her son, Ronnie Heslop, is the city magistrate. So this novel is set obviously in a fictional Indian city. It could be perhaps somewhere in central India where we don't really know. The city is called Chandrapur. It's mentioned in the very first line, the very first sentence of the novel, which is at the novel begins thus, except for the Marabar Caves, and they are 20 miles off. The city of Chandrapur presents nothing extraordinary. Right? So somewhere perhaps in central North India, there is a mention of the river Ganges as well. Right? So we have Adela Quested, as I said. Then we have Mrs. Moore, we have Ronnie Heslop, and then we have an Englishman who is the principal of a college. His name is Mr. Fielding. And we have Turton, who is a city collector, Major Calendar, who is a civil surgeon. So he is the superior to whom Dr. Aziz reports. And we have Mr. McBride, who is um, the police inspector and the person, in fact, who is going to prosecute the case. So if we're looking at the novel here, what is very briefly the plot line, and then we will get, and then I'll get into a few considerations, speak about what interests me about the novel, and why I think, in fact, this novel is not simply a superb specimen of 20th century English literature, but why I think that some of the criticisms of the novel are perhaps misguided. This is not to say that there may not be elements that are disturbing, perhaps in some sense, in the novel, but I think viewed on totality, I think it's an extraordinarily rich work of literature. So Adela Quested and Mrs. Moore arrive in India, and the purpose of their visit is, well, Mrs. Moore perhaps can be described as wanting to see her son, wanting an occasion to visit India. And Miss Quested wants to make up her mind. She wants to make up her mind, that is, about whether she really wants to be married to Ronnie Heslop. And so she comes to India, and they're in quest of something else as well. The two of them, they're in quest of something called the real India. And so they want to actually get a sense of the place, get a feel for it, understand the smells of the country, uh, the the palette of colors that the country offers, the nature of Indian religiosity, perhaps. Right? That's what they mean. You know, what are Indians in flesh and blood like? And that's what they mean, perhaps, by wanting to experience the real India. And this question becomes a paramount question right from the outset, because one of the things that the novel suggests quite amply, and I think it is entirely right in doing so, is that the English are living in something like a bubble. A bubble. Right? So the main center of English activity, as sketched in the novel, is the club. And the club was a private institution. I forget who once remarked that once two Englishmen get together, particularly two Englishmen who don't know each other, and if they're in a strange setting, all the more so, the first instinct is to form a club. It's a very English institution, it seems, becomes part of the ethos of Anglophone America. And of course, the club was an institution that, to use the post colonial jargon and the jargon of our times, was a highly racialized and gendered institution. Women were excluded from it. This particular club in Chandrapur, Indians, of course, are excluded from it. And it's only for the English. It's a cabal of Englishmen who can get together. Well, women are there as well sometimes, but really for the most part, it's really meant for the men. And of course, I mean, you know, there are clubs where women are excluded. There have been clubs in Washington D.C. that, until relatively recent years, excluded women, elite men's clubs. The Chandrapur Club doesn't exclude women, but clearly there is a demarcation, a gender demarcation within the club itself as well. Uh, that is not necessarily central to the novel, but much of the activity outside other places such as the caves, which I will get to in a moment, really takes place in what we might describe as spaces defined by the English. The club is the most preeminent of them, and then we get the courtroom, right? The modern courtroom, uh, where we see the adversary system in place. So Ms. Quested, Adela Quested, and Mrs. Moore arrive in India, and if we had to really think about the plot of this book, and we had to think about, what are the different, what we might call divisions, um, where the action takes place. So the first scene is doubtless the arrival of Adela Quested and Mrs. Moore in India. And then it's suggested to them that, well, perhaps they should be, when they express a desire to see the real India, then it's suggested that, that perhaps it's going to be what's called a bridge party, right? A bridge party is, as Forster also says, a party to bridge the gap between the Indians and the English. Of course, none of the English really take it seriously. And one of the things about Adela and Mrs. Moore is that they are, in a manner of speaking, innocent, right? They don't really understand how their own countrymen really work in the colonies. Right? So there is a scene in the book uh, where Adela Quested and Mrs. Moore are going to suggest that, well, the Indians are not really being treated respectfully. So when this bridge party takes place, well, the English are kind of arrogant. The Indians are all at one side of the garden. Um, and Ronnie Heslop has a rejoinder or an answer to this charge, because his fundamental submission here is that we're not actually here in India to behave pleasantly. Right? So we're just going to look at this passage very briefly, uh, where this issue is discussed, and um, uh, this is page 49 of the edition that I have. So, what did I tell you? He exclaimed, losing his gentle manner. I knew it last week. Oh, how like a woman to worry over a side issue. This is a continuation of a correspondence that's going on. I begin with this because here we enter into another charge against Forster, that there is a kind of rampant sexism in the novel, right? How like a woman to worry over a side issue. Of course, we also have to understand that, as in all works of fiction, we have to try to understand what is the voice of the narrator, what is the voice of the novelist, um, and is in fact actually the narrator using the device of putting in words into the character to in fact actually excuse his own conduct, his own train of thought, to suggest that, well, this is not really my train of thought. I'm simply echoing what was the prevailing sentiment, right? So she forgot about Adela in her surprise. A side issue, she here is Mrs. Moore, a side issue, a side issue. How can it be that? We're not here for the purpose of behaving pleasantly, says Ronnie Heslop to his mother. What do you mean? What I say. We are out here to do justice and keep the peace. Them's my sentiments. India isn't a drawing room. Your sentiments are those of a god, she said quietly. But it was his manner rather than his sentiments that annoyed her. Trying to recover his temper, he said, India likes gods. And Englishmen, Mrs. Moore says, like posing as gods. So, so this is here is an illustration of where Forster is showing the tension. The tension is not only between the Indians and the English. This is a tension between the English who have arrived recently and who are not fully conversant, Forster seems to be saying, with the reigning sentiment among the English. And that sentiment is, of course, a very condescending one among the English living in India towards the Indians. So, first scene, so to speak, if one had to think of it in that way, is the arrival of Adela and Mrs. Moore. Then we have the bridge party. This is going to be followed by another party, which is Fielding's Tea Party, because at this bridge party, Adela meets an Englishman by the name of Mr. Fielding. Mr. Fielding, it becomes very clear in the novel, is an Englishman who's been living in India for many years, but who does not see eye to eye with his fellow Englishmen. So, unlike his fellow Englishmen who have ostracized the Indians, or if I may put it in another language, who have outcasted them, right? Because the English here behave like the Brahmins. Right? Unlike them, Mr. Fielding is a manner is in a manner of speaking an Englishman who is comfortable with the Indians. He consorts with them. He has Indian friends, and therefore, of course, he is excluded from the culture of the English club. Now, at this tea party, there is present an Indian whom we have encountered in the novel before. That's Dr. Aziz. He is going to be the principal character of this novel. And they strike up a conversation. Aziz and Fielding seem to get along very well. Um, Adela and Mrs. Moore are part of the conversation. Ms. Adela becomes intrigued by many of the things that Dr. Aziz says, and then during the course of the conversation, he offers to host them at his home, and then immediately perhaps realizes that, well, perhaps not. That's not the best place to host uh, these English people who are visiting from abroad, and suggests that, well, perhaps there will be an expedition to the Marabar Caves. Right? So these Marabar Caves are caves that he himself has not seen, it so transpires, and it's a bit of an expedition to get there, but now he's committed to it. So the next scene will move to the Marabar Caves where the expedition takes place, and uh, it so transpires during the course of this trip or expedition to the Marabar Caves that the last stretch of it is one where Dr. Aziz and Adela are going to be left alone, along with an Indian guide, and something transpires in Adela Quested's imagination. Something transpires. Right? She has gone into one of the caves alone while Aziz is having a smoke outside another cave. She's gone into a cave, and the next thing he knows, he can't find her when he's looking for her. And she runs stumbling out of a cave in a panic, and is subsequently going to allege that Dr. Aziz may have attempted to rape her. Or let's put it in a different language, the language more really of those times, he has perhaps offended the sexual modesty of a young English woman. So when Aziz comes back into town with Fielding, and here I'm not giving all the particulars of the whole expedition, at what point Fielding joined it. When he comes back into town, he is going to be arrested and he is going to be put on trial. And so then the novel then moves to the last phase of the story, where during the course of the trial, Aziz is going to be acquitted. Miss Adela is going to recant her words, her charges, and subsequent to the conclusion of the trial, there is a what you might call a post-trial phase, uh, where there's a series of conversations among some of the characters, and then finally, moving to the conclusion of the book, in the last portion of the book, the story actually moves to Kashmir. Dr. Aziz has relocated because Chandrapur is no longer a place where he can really, with dignity, even though he has been acquitted. But he also wants to leave behind the memories of this whole ugly incident where his reputation has been stained. Right? It's a question of what um, Indians call izzat, a word that is very much part of the vocabulary of mainstream Indian cinema, and was certainly part of the vocabulary of nearly every Indian film in the 60s, 70s, 80s, perhaps to a lesser degree now, but certainly was the case in films going back to the 40s, 50s, all the way to perhaps the 80s and 90s. So he has relocated to Kashmir, where he is now the physician to the Maharaja of Kashmir. And in the last scene of the book, he and Fielding are going to meet once again for the last time, and Fielding is going to press him to, you know, consider him as friend, to keep in touch with him. And Aziz says, "Well, it's not really possible. It's not really possible until India is free." Right? So I'll halt here for the time being, and come back shortly with, in another talk with a discussion of some of the key issues that arise from this book. And what I'm going to be discussing in the second half of my talk about this book are such things as the nature of friendship. Right? Is it possible, according to Forster's view, is it possible for the Indians and the English to be friends at a time when India was colonized by the British? There's one set of questions around friendship. Then there's another set of questions around how do we interpret the characters of Mr. Fielding, Adela Quested, and Mrs. Moore? Now, I take these three together because, in some respects, they seem to signify the possibilities of a conversation, of a dialogue, the possibilities of friendship, perhaps, between Indians and the English. And what do these people really signify? Do they signify a different kind of imagination coming out of England? And by this, I don't mean to suggest that all three of the characters are similar, right? But in this respect, that they seem to have some sympathies, unlike the British in India, unlike the British in India, right? They seem to have some sympathy for Indians. But this also leads to another tricky question. And that tricky question is that, is Forster really suggesting that, well, you see, one can have lofty sentiments about the other in the abstract, because the English in England can afford to have sentiments of sympathy, of friendship, of affection for the Indians. But when they're in India, do they take up the position that Ronnie Heslop did? That we are not here to be pleasant. We're here to discharge our duty. And our duty, among many other things, is to keep the peace in the country, to enforce law and order, to ensure that Hindus and Muslims are not at each other's throats. Is there something of that? Has Forster tacitly fallen into that way of thinking? But there's another sort of very interesting questions. I think, for example, if you take the character of Dr. Aziz and Mr. Fielding, is there on the part of especially Dr. Aziz something like a homo-erotic sentiment here? And I mention this because we have to, this is where the biography of the novelist may be instructive. I recall, of course, that I had said in an earlier talk, I think in my talk on Nandi's Intimate Enemy, that sometimes we don't want to know much about the novelist or the writer of a work. Now, in this case, the one singular fact that is very, very interesting about E M Forster, apart from the kind of liberal disposition he had in general, is that E M Forster was a man who, for decades, was very happy in a homosexual relationship with a working class Englishman. And Forster's last novel, which, as I seem to recall, was published posthumously, was a novel called Maurice. I think written shortly before I think he passed away. So Forster was unquestionably a homosexual. And I think in the culture of his times, it would have been nearly impossible for him to have come out in the open about that. So when we look at the character of Dr. Aziz, and then we look at his relationship with Fielding, it seems that there are touches of that, particularly on the side of Dr. Aziz. But I mentioned this because I think that the novel lends itself to various kinds of complexities that I think we would have to be sensitive to, rather than thinking of it in the way in which I think some of the critics of the novel have thought about it. So one of these critics is the post-colonial critic Benita Parry, who thought that the novel was more or less, implicated in the kind of rampant sexism and racism of those times. And it's not clear to me that that is really the case. But rather than offering a full-fledged account of that right now, I shall do so in the second half of this talk.